the Moxy or tissue oximeters are going to give us. So it's going to look something like this. Let's go to the next slide. Oh, there we go. Okay, sorry, a little hand there. Okay, it's going to look something like this. So for those of you that know the critical power model, the time limit, so the time you have left in your performance ability is related to W prime and to the difference in your performance to your critical power. And the way that we look at it is that this W prime has something to do with this regional O2 saturation, which is what Perry and Fari highlight as information we're getting out of the tissue oximeter. And this critical power and power difference has something to do with the balance between your oxygen supply and your oxygen demand. And so we see that there's structure here that we can use for a gray box model. And to make this a little bit easier, especially for those of you who maybe don't know the critical power model so well, you can consider your O2 saturation, the value you have, this reserve that we talked about, as some kind of battery that you have available to you. In the critical power model, it's often thought of as a battery. I think it's a good analogy, which has a limited amount of charge. When the charge is empty, your battery is empty. And the oxygen supply and demand you can think of as a charging capacity that you have. Okay, and so if you need more power than your charge capacity can give you, well, you're going to keep draining your battery. The battery won't be able to recharge. So I hope that visually that helps people think about this a little bit. One of the most important things for me that to point out now is that this link between this critical power model and what we're doing with muscle oxygenation isn't as one-to-one as I'm presenting it here. It's more the phenomenon seems to represent each other quite well, so it's a good basis to start modeling from. So this is what we did. We have an SmO2 input. As the basic initial structure, we have some idea of critical power, and our output is going to be this time limit, or better said, this battery, which is going to be in some kind of arbitrary units that we're defining. And so in order to generate our first models for this, we did a series of different tests, and this is one of the experiments that we did. We took 20 participants, and they did knee extensions. And they did knee extensions, 4 different tests of knee extensions. One was a maximal intensity test, an MVC, and then they did constant workload knee extensions at 5, 10, and 20% of their maximal intensity. And they did all of these knee extensions to failure. This was set up with failure conditions and with a metronome with the same rate of extensions and constant workload. And we did all of these tests in 2 conditions. We did them in a normal condition, which I'm going to call normal, and we did them in an occluded condition. So we tied off their leg, so like a closed system. And we measured NIRS on the different muscle heads of the quadricep, and we measured performance in EMG and so on. And what we got out of this, this is an example of one participant. We get this kind of expected response from the NIRS data. So on the left side, we have 3 curves of the 5, 10, and 20% condition when the leg is occluded. We see they all kind of come down to the same minimum. They have maybe a little bit steepness of the curve is a little bit different, but very, very similar responses with minimal time difference, actually, despite the intensity difference in the occluded state. In the non-occluded state on the right-hand side, you have quite a different picture because we have blood flow, and blood supply really can mess things up with NIRS because we don't really know. It's hard to determine what exactly is happening in an active system. But what we see is clearly there's a different amplitude of where SmO2 is going down, and we see that the activities go on much longer when the leg is not occluded, especially for the lighter conditions, so the blue and the red conditions. which are the 5 and 10%. There's some clear differences here. Now, if we think about our gray box model, the idea is still, if these tasks are all happening to failure, in either condition, we should have a battery indicator, or arbitrary units, that should stay somehow constant, right? Battery's empty, you fail your task. And SmO2 is supposed to show us when our task fails. So we did some initial modeling of this, some very, very basic modeling at the beginning, essentially just deltas of SmO2. And this is what we get in these kind of arbitrary units. On the left-hand side, this is the modeling of the included, and the right-hand side is the modeling of the non-included. And the integrals here are identify this kind of battery that we have. And when we look at what these arbitrary units are in magnitude, we get during the occlusion over the 3 conditions, you get fairly similar values. Again, these are just arbitrary units, but the idea or the hypothesis was that all these sizes would be the same. The battery remains the same size. And in this occluded condition, it seems to work pretty good. That's not very difficult to see that it would be that way. If we look at the raw SmO2 data on the left here, it's basically the same curve. So, okay, we would expect that to happen. The right-hand side is very different. And what do we get out of our modeling? Well, we get this huge discrepancy. First of all, the values get much smaller. That actually happens with the W prime value as well. If you occlude and unocclude, you get smaller W prime values. But it generally being smaller values didn't bother me that much, but it's more there's a big discrepancy between the 3. The battery size is completely different. So this doesn't seem to be very useful. So, well, we're doing modeling and we're using our gray box modeling techniques, and we can try a different model. So on the left-hand side here, we have our initial model, and on the right-hand side, we have M2. That's our second model. And we do some adjustments based on previous data, and you get a somewhat different looking model. It still looks quite similar, and there's a lot of change in above 0, so which would be like in recovery parameters. And let's see what that does to our data. So now if we go back to this, looking at how big are these batteries then, we get our occlusion, which we said are the same. We get our model 1, which is completely different, and now we get our model 2. And our model 2 has already made significant improvements, in my opinion, to equalizing how big the 3 models would be, how big the 3 batteries would be, assuming that they should all be equal. These are our preliminary model steps for the idea to generate this gray box model that would give us this information about this relationship between the battery that I have available to me, the supply and demand of oxygen I have that's recharging this battery. And the end result should be when my battery's empty, I can no longer continue my task at the given intensity. So it should be predicting performance outcomes. I hope that wasn't too much. I think I maintained my time as well, and I hope it was clear for everyone. I can never really tell. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Andrew. A great presentation and introduction to that topic. Do you have any publications planned for this topic?
Yeah. So this data is. So I'm currently writing up. So the initial, we have multiple projects planned or multiple to do more data set. Because I mean, basically, the more data, the better. Okay, sorry, Roger. I'm gonna backtrack one. The problem that I have is based on all the data that I've seen over the years is that I think there's lots of pitfalls in this modeling. It's gonna be very based on. So I think it's very possible to come up with a very good predictive model in a very tight area of use. So if you really limit the scope of where you're using it, I think you can get very good prediction rates, in my opinion, based on what I've seen. The broader you start taking the data, the harder it's going to get. And so I planned multiple projects to kind of increase the different types of data that I'm getting. And yeah, there's publications planned. So we're working on publication right now.
Do you envision this being something that you would see in real time, or would this be an analysis that you did after the workout?
I think if it has really, if it's useful, I think it should be in real time. Again, if I think the feasibility of that has to very much do with how tight you put the setup around what you're trying to predict. I think a broad prediction rate could be difficult.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much. Let's see, I'm not seeing any other questions come in. So if you have any additional follow-up with Andrew, or you want to learn more about what he's doing with this model, certainly connect with him in the Discord chat. We could also, you can also check out his YouTube channel, like I mentioned, and I think you can connect with him through that. So thank you very much, Andrew. We appreciate that presentation.
Thanks, Roger. Thank you, everyone, for listening.